There is a kind of loneliness that lives alongside everything else, alongside success and friendship, and a life that looks, from the outside, completely full. Rock Hudson understood that kind of loneliness more intimately than most people would ever know. He was, for a significant stretch of the 1950s and 1960s, one of the most famous men in America. Handsome in a way that photographers could barely keep up with. Beloved by audiences across the country. A natural ease on screen that made difficult work look effortless, and that drew people to him in a way very few actors have ever managed. He was also, privately, someone who had learned from a very young age that there was a version of himself that the world expected, and that the real version of himself needed to stay carefully, quietly hidden. Not just from the public, but from almost everyone. The era he lived and worked in offered no room for who he actually was. And so he learned to be the person the room needed, in whatever room he was in, so completely that some people who knew him for years never had any sense that there was another room entirely, one he inhabited alone, without company, without the ease that everyone around him assumed was simply his natural state. Those who were close enough to see any of this described it in similar terms. He was genuinely warm, genuinely generous, genuinely funny, genuinely interested in the people around him. None of that was a performance, exactly, but underneath the warmth there was something that never quite found a place to land. A part of him that couldn't be brought into the rooms he was in. A truth about himself that required constant, careful management just to keep out of view. That kind of sustained concealment is its own particular form of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone. Rock Hudson was almost never alone in the conventional sense, but the loneliness of being surrounded and still not known. Of laughing and talking and connecting and having all of that be real and still carrying something every day that could never be part of any of it. Near the end of his life, as his health declined and some of what had been hidden could no longer be kept that way, he spoke publicly for the first time about aspects of his life that had been private for decades. Those who spoke with him in those final months often described someone who seemed, in some ways, lighter. As if the relief of no longer having to manage the distance between his public and private self, even as everything else became harder, had given him something he hadn't fully experienced before. A particular kind of rest. The rest of not having to hold two things apart anymore. That was the quiet truth. That carrying a secret, any secret, not just his, and not just that kind, takes energy. Sustained, daily, invisible energy. And when the carrying finally stops, what arrives isn't just relief. It's rest. The kind of rest that comes from finally being able to put something down that you've been holding for a very long time. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe there's something you carry, not a secret in the same sense perhaps, but something private, something you've never quite been able to bring into the rooms you occupy. A fear, a grief, a feeling about your life that doesn't match the version of yourself you present to most people. A part of yourself that you've learned, over years, to keep carefully to one side. And, Maybe you've gotten so used to carrying it that you've almost stopped noticing it's there. It's just part of how you move through the world. The slight management, the constant low-level awareness of what can be shown and what can't. The effort of being one version of yourself out there and a different one, quieter and less finished, in the privacy of your own mind. Here's something gentle to consider. You don't have to share everything with everyone. Privacy is not the same as concealment, and not every part of yourself needs to be visible in every room. But somewhere, with at least one person, in at least one conversation, there may be a version of you that's been waiting to simply exist without management. Even one person who knows the fuller version of you makes the carrying lighter. Not because they take it from you, but because you're no longer the only one who knows it's there. That shared weight, oddly, tends to feel less heavy than a solitary one, even when nothing about the situation itself has changed. Rock Hudson spent most of his life being admired by millions of people who felt they knew him, who felt the warmth he offered was complete, that the person on screen and in the photographs was the whole person. And in many ways, they were right. He was warm, he was genuine, he was everything they felt. But there was a room inside all of that they couldn't see. A room where he was alone in a way none of the warmth could quite reach. Maybe there's a room like that in you, too, one you've kept closed for so long that opening it feels almost impossible. Maybe not to the world, but to one person. Someone safe enough, someone trusted enough, someone who has already proven they're not going anywhere. What might it be like to let that person in, even slightly, not necessarily to solve anything? Not with any expectation that they'll know what to say, just to let them know the room is there, that it exists, that you've been in it, alone, for a while. Most people, when trusted with something like that, don't back away. They lean in. Because being trusted with the real version of someone, the less finished, less managed, more honest version, is something most people experience as an honor, not a burden. You might be surprised how much lighter the carrying gets once even one person knows. Not because they fix anything, but because you're no longer alone in a room that used to have only you in it. Rock Hudson's final chapter was, by any conventional measure, very hard. But those who knew him in those months also said something striking, that there was a quality to him in those conversations that hadn't been there before. A directness. A willingness to simply be wherever he was without managing the distance. A fullness of presence that the sustained concealment had for decades made unavailable. It arrived late for him. It doesn't have to arrive late for you. If you're watching this tonight, maybe there's someone, one person, you could trust with a slightly fuller version of yourself this week. Not everything, not all at once, just a little more than usual, a little less managed, a little more real. There's one more thing worth sitting with, something that comes from the other direction entirely. Maybe you're not the one who's been carrying something alone. Maybe you're the person in someone else's life who could be let in if they trusted you enough. If they believed you were safe enough to show the fuller version to. And maybe, without quite realizing it, you've given them signals that you are too busy, or too practical, or too likely to respond with advice, when what they needed was simply someone to be there. Not because you don't care, but because most of us are never taught how to simply receive what someone shows us, without immediately trying to help it, or fix it, or move it somewhere more comfortable. What if the most valuable thing you could offer someone this week wasn't advice, or solutions, or an encouraging reframe? What if it was simply this: I don't need you to manage this around me. Whatever you're actually feeling, I can handle it. I'm not going to be scared off or try to fix it. I just want to know you. That kind of invitation, offered without pressure, without any demand that the other person respond, can sometimes open a door that's been closed for years. Not because the person didn't want it open, but because they were waiting to feel sure it was safe. Hudson, for most of his life, didn't feel sure it was safe. The world he lived in wasn't safe, not in the literal sense, not in that era, not with that particular truth. That was real, and it was the world's failure, not his. Most of us carry things that are much smaller than that, but the pattern is similar. We stay behind the managed version of ourselves until something makes it feel safe to step forward. Sometimes that something is an illness that removes the option. And sometimes, more gently, more fortunately, it's simply a person who makes it clear, without pressure, that the fuller version is welcome. You could be that person for someone, maybe this week. Maybe with just a few quiet words that say, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. And whatever you want to show me is safe with me. That's a remarkable thing to offer another person. And it costs very little. Just attention and presence, and the willingness to stay in a room that's less comfortable than the managed version. Hudson once played, on screen, exactly the kind of man who always knew what to do. Steady, strong, certain. Off-screen, he was someone much more human than that. Much more uncertain. Much more in need of the same simple things that everyone needs. To be known. To be safe. To share the weight with someone who isn't going to run. If you're watching this tonight, maybe there's a room in your life, or in someone else's, that could use a little company. Not a cure, not a solution, just company. So take a slow breath, and maybe this week let one person in, even slightly, to the quieter room. The one that's been waiting a long time for a little company.